My name is Tessa, and at 34 years old, I was publicly discarded by my high society in-laws for being a broken machine. During the Davenport family's lavish 10-year anniversary dinner, my mother-in-law threw my private medical records onto the table, demanding my husband divorce his barren wife. He looked at the floor and agreed. I did not cry. Instead, I signed the divorce papers on the spot, threw bank statements in his face, proving he was a thief, and walked out. What they did not know was that the medical records were fake, and the phone call I received in the rain that night would give me the power to destroy their entire empire. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to people who thought they could break you. Growing up, I learned that hard work and integrity were the only currencies that mattered. But for the Davenport family, the only things that mattered were bloodlines, appearances, and the ruthless pursuit of status. My husband Malcolm and I had been married for 8 years, and for every single one of those days, his mother Beatrice made sure I knew I did not belong. I was a food science researcher, someone who worked in laboratories rather than attending high society galas in Atlanta. I did not come from their elite circles, and to Beatrice, my lack of pedigree was a stain on the Davenport name. The 10-year anniversary of the Davenport Investment Fund was supposed to be a night of celebration. Beatrice had rented out the most exclusive private dining room at a luxury restaurant in Buckhead. The room was dripping in opulence from the crystal chandeliers overhead to the heavy silver cutlery arranged perfectly on the crisp white tablecloths. Waiters in pristine uniforms moved silently around the room, pouring vintage champagne into crystal flutes. It was exactly the kind of over-the-top display my mother-in-law lived for. I sat next to Malcolm wearing a black dress I had carefully selected to blend in rather than stand out. Across the table sat my sister-in-law Bianca and her husband Preston. Preston was a white man from a family that claimed to have generations of old money. Beatrice treated him like royalty, constantly bragging about his aristocratic roots to anyone who would listen. Bianca wore a smug expression, her hand resting protectively over her slightly rounded stomach. They had recently announced they were expecting their first child, a revelation that had intensified the suffocating pressure I felt every time I was in the same room as my in-laws. For years, Malcolm and I had tried to start a family. The negative tests, the endless doctor's appointments, the silent tears in the middle of the night had worn me down. Through it all, I thought Malcolm and I were a team. I thought his quiet demeanor was his way of coping with our shared heartbreak. I had no idea his silence was actually cowardice. The evening progressed with wealthy investors and family friends giving toast after toast to the Davenport legacy. Finally, it was Beatrice's turn. She stood at the head of the table, her signature pearls gleaming under the chandelier light. She tapped her spoon against her champagne flute, demanding absolute silence. The room quieted instantly. Beatrice commanded obedience, and her family always delivered. 10 years ago, we built this fund on the principles of excellence and legacy. Beatrice began, her sharp gaze sweeping across the room before landing directly on me. A legacy is only as strong as the bloodline that carries it forward. Tonight, I am proud to officially announce that my son Malcolm will be taking over as the Chief Executive Officer of the Davenport Investment Fund. Polite applause broke out around the table. I turned to Malcolm, offering him a supportive smile, but he refused to meet my eyes. He stared rigidly at his untouched plate, his jaw tight. A cold knot formed in my stomach. Something was wrong. Beatrice raised her hand, silencing the applause. However, she continued, her voice turning hard and clinical, the leader of this family must be a man capable of producing an heir. The Davenport empire cannot be entrusted to a dead end. Before I could process her words, Beatrice reached into her designer handbag and pulled out a thick manila folder. With a swift, deliberate motion, she threw it across the long table. It slid over the white linen and stopped directly in front of my plate. The bold red letters of the fertility clinic we had visited were stamped across the top. "Those are your medical records, Tessa," Beatrice announced loudly, ensuring every investor, every family friend, and every waiter in the room could hear her. They confirm what I have suspected all along. You are completely barren. You are an empty vessel, a woman entirely incapable of giving this family what it requires. You have wasted 8 years of my son's life, but I will not allow you to waste another second. The entire dining room froze. The silence was deafening. I felt the blood drain from my face as I stared at the highly confidential medical file resting against my plate. The sheer cruelty of airing my deepest, most agonizing pain in front of a room full of strangers was paralyzing. I looked at Beatrice expecting to see a shred of human empathy, but her eyes held nothing but triumphant malice. "You will leave our home tonight," Beatrice commanded, her voice ringing out like a gavel striking wood. "You will pack your meager belongings, and you will not take a single thing paid for by Davenport money. You do not belong here, Tessa. You never did." My hands trembled in my lap. I turned to the man I had loved and supported for 8 years, the man who had held me while I cried over negative pregnancy tests, the man who had promised we would face everything together. "Malcolm," I whispered, my voice thick with shock. "Say something. Tell her this is insane." Malcolm did not look up. He kept his eyes glued to the expensive porcelain plate in front of him. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely a mumble, yet it echoed loudly in the silent room. "Mother is right, Tessa," he said. "I am sorry, but I need a real family. I cannot be the CEO of this fund and not have a legacy. I need an heir, and you cannot give me one." The betrayal hit me with physical force. It was not just the public humiliation. It was the realization that he had known about this ambush. He had orchestrated it with her. He was throwing me away because I was no longer biologically useful to his family's vanity. Bianca let out a sharp, mocking laugh from across the table. "Honestly, Tessa, I do not know why you look so surprised. You have been holding my brother back for years. Look at Preston and me. We are building the next generation of this family. My husband comes from actual heritage, and we are adding to it. You are just a broken machine. It is time for you to be replaced." Preston chuckled, swirling his wineglass with an air of arrogant superiority. "It is just business, Tessa. Cut your losses and move on. You cannot compete with good breeding." I looked at the faces surrounding me. Beatrice practically glowing with victory, Bianca and Preston reveling in my degradation, and Malcolm a weak, spineless shell of a man who would rather destroy his wife than stand up to his mother. In that moment, the crushing despair that had gripped me evaporated. The tears that had threatened to fall completely dried up. A profound, icy clarity washed over me. I was not going to let these people break me. I was not going to give them the satisfaction of my tears. Beatrice signaled to one of her lawyers who had been sitting quietly near the back of the room. He stepped forward and placed a crisp legal document right on top of my medical file. "This is a divorce decree," Beatrice stated, sliding a heavy gold pen toward me. "It outlines that you are leaving this marriage exactly as you entered it, penniless. Sign it now and we will avoid a drawn-out legal battle. Refuse and I will make sure my legal team buries you so deep you will not be able to afford a studio apartment in this city." I looked down at the divorce decree. They thought I would fight for a piece of their toxic empire. They thought I would beg to stay. Slowly, I reached out and picked up the gold pen. I did not hesitate. I did not read the fine print. I flipped to the last page and signed my name with sharp, deliberate strokes. I pushed the paper back toward Beatrice. She looked slightly taken aback by how quickly I complied, a frown touching the corners of her mouth. She had wanted a fight, a scene where she could further humiliate a desperate woman. Instead, I gave her nothing but compliance. "There," I said, my voice steady and cold. "I am officially done with this family. But before I go, Malcolm, I have something for you." I picked up my purse from the floor and opened it. I reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of bank statements I had printed out earlier that week. I had noticed discrepancies in our finances and had been investigating them quietly. Now it was time to share my findings. With a flick of my wrist, I threw the papers directly at Malcolm's face. The sheets separated in the air, raining down over his plate, his wineglass, and the pristine white tablecloth. Malcolm flinched, swatting at the papers. "What is this?" he demanded, finally looking at me. "Those are our joint account records. I said loudly, making sure my voice carried to the back of the room. The records that show you secretly withdrew $30,000 last Tuesday. I was going to ask you about it privately, but since we are doing everything in front of an audience tonight, let us discuss it. Beatrice narrowed her eyes. Malcolm, what is she talking about? I will tell you what she is talking about, Beatrice. I continued standing up from my chair. Your perfect son stole $30,000 from our shared savings to pay off a gambling syndicate. And he did not do it for himself. He did it for your precious aristocratic son-in-law. I pointed a finger straight at Preston, whose arrogant smirk vanished instantly. He went completely pale, his eyes darting frantically around the room as the wealthy investors began to murmur among themselves. Preston owes massive debts to underground bookies, I stated clearly. Your golden boy with his fake old money heritage is drowning in gambling debt, and Malcolm has been secretly using my hard-earned savings to bail him out so you would not find out. That is a lie, Preston sputtered, practically jumping out of his chair. She is making it up because she is bitter. The bank transfer numbers are right there on the table. I fired back. The routing numbers match Preston's offshore accounts. You are welcome to verify them, Beatrice. Check the dates. Check the amounts. Your son is a thief, and your son-in-law is a degenerate gambler. Bianca stared at her husband in horror. Malcolm was frantically trying to gather the papers, his hands shaking violently. You wanted me to leave with nothing, I said, looking down at Malcolm with absolute disgust. But you already took my money to cover up for his pathetic mistakes. Enjoy your CEO title, Malcolm. Enjoy your perfect family. I will be seeing you in court for every single cent you stole from me. I turned my back on the table, ignoring the sudden eruption of chaotic arguments breaking out among my former in-laws. Beatrice was shouting at Preston. Bianca was crying. Malcolm was stammering excuses. I did not stay to watch the fallout. I walked toward the heavy oak doors of the private dining room, keeping my head held high and my shoulders pulled back. I did not look back once. When I stepped out of the restaurant, the humid Atlanta air hit me like a physical wall. A heavy thunderstorm had rolled in, and rain was coming down in sheets, washing the streets in a gray, blurry haze. I stood under the restaurant's awning, watching the rain bounce off the pavement. I had just lost my marriage, my home, and my savings in the span of 30 minutes. I was entirely alone. But as I took a deep breath of the rain-scented air, I realized something incredible. I felt free. For the first time in 8 years, the suffocating weight of the Davenport family was gone. I reached into my pocket to call a taxi when my phone began to vibrate. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. It was an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. "Hello," I said over the sound of the pouring rain. "Tessa," a voice asked frantically on the other end. The voice belonged to a man, and he sounded completely out of breath, as if he had been running. "Yes, this is Tessa. Who is this?" "This is Dr. Aris, from the Davenport Family Clinic." My grip on the phone tightened. The same doctor who had issued the medical file Beatrice had just thrown in my face. "What do you want?" I asked sharply. "Your clinic has already done enough damage to me tonight." "Tessa, you have to listen to me," Dr. Aris pleaded, his voice cracking with panic. "I am so sorry. I cannot carry this guilt anymore. The records your mother-in-law has, the ones saying you are infertile, they are fake. I forged them." The world around me seemed to stop. The sound of the rain faded into a dull hum. "What did you just say?" "You are perfectly healthy, Tessa. You are completely capable of having children." The doctor confessed his words, tumbling out rapidly. 8 years ago, Beatrice Davenport came to me. She paid me a massive amount of money to swap the test results. I needed the money to pay off medical school debts, and I was foolish enough to accept her bribe. I felt my knees go weak. I leaned against the brick column of the restaurant to steady myself. "If I am healthy," I whispered, the terrifying reality beginning to dawn on me. "Then who?" "It is Malcolm," Dr. Aris interrupted, confirming my unspoken question. "Malcolm is the one who is biologically sterile. He was born with a condition that makes it physically impossible for him to ever father a child. Beatrice knew this. She knew her son could never produce an heir. So she paid me to forge the documents and place all the blame entirely on you. She wanted to protect his male pride and the family image. A cold, sharp shock traveled down my spine. 8 years. 8 years of agonizing guilt. 8 years of believing my body was broken. 8 years of enduring Beatrice's emotional abuse and Malcolm's fake sympathy. They had built my entire nightmare on a lie. Malcolm was the broken one, and Beatrice had orchestrated the whole thing to protect his fragile ego while systematically destroying my sanity. "Why are you telling me this now?" I demanded, my voice trembling with rising fury. "Because Beatrice's accountant is being audited, and the bribe money I took is going to be traced back to my clinic," Dr. Aris admitted desperately. "The truth is going to leak, Tessa. The authorities are going to find out, and I'm going to lose my medical license. I wanted to tell you before it goes public. I am so sorry." The line went dead. I stood under the awning, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. The rain continued to pour, soaking the streets of Buckhead. Inside that restaurant, Malcolm and Beatrice thought they had completely ruined my life. They thought they had discarded me without consequence. But as I stared out into the stormy night, a fierce, undeniable fire ignited in my chest. They had stolen my money, my time, and my peace of mind. They had lied to me in the most fundamental, devastating way possible. But they had made one massive, fatal mistake. They had underestimated exactly who they were dealing with. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and stepped out into the rain. Let them have their dinner. Let them fight over their gambling debts and their fake prestige. My grief was gone, entirely replaced by a singular, burning purpose. I was going to take everything from them, and I was going to enjoy every single second of it. The rain soaked through my black dress as I stood under the awning of the restaurant, but I could not feel the cold. The voice of Dr. Aris, echoing through the phone speaker, had completely paralyzed my nervous system for a fraction of a second before a wave of pure, unadulterated fury washed over me. 8 years. I had spent 8 years tracking my ovulation, taking hormone injections that made me violently ill, and crying on the bathroom floor of the Davenport mansion because I believed my body was failing the man I loved. I had endured Beatrice sneering at family holidays about my empty womb. I had watched Bianca parade her pregnancies around me like trophies. All the while, Malcolm knew. He knew he was the one born with a biological dead end, and he let his mother buy my medical trauma to protect his fragile masculine ego. I did not scream. I did not throw my phone into the wet pavement. Anger that hot does not explode, it crystallizes. I ended the call and blocked Dr. Aris from my contacts. There would be time to deal with his medical malpractice later. Right now, I had to secure the only thing of value I had left before the Davenports realized I was not just walking away to lick my wounds. I hailed a cab and gave the driver the address to my private laboratory space near Georgia Tech. Beatrice thought I spent my days tinkering with useless food science projects that yielded no social capital. What she and Malcolm did not know was that my research in organic chemical structures had led me to develop a predictive algorithm. Initially designed to map molecular degradation, I had recently realized the code was perfectly adaptable to financial markets. It could predict market volatility with terrifying accuracy. I had been refining it in secret, pouring every ounce of my frustration into the code. It was my escape plan. Now it was my weapon. I spent the entire night in the lab packing my hard drives and wiping the local servers clean. By the time the sun rose over the Atlanta skyline, Tessa Davenport no longer existed. I reverted to my maiden name. I secured a modest apartment on the outskirts of the city and began the quiet, meticulous work of building my future. 6 months dragged by in a blur of legal summons and silent preparation. The Davenports thought they had won. They thought they had discarded a useless liability. But their arrogance made them sloppy, and their desperation was beginning to show. I knew exactly how bad their financial situation was because I had seen the bank statements before I left. Preston was bleeding the Davenport investment fund dry with his gambling debts, and Malcolm lacked the backbone or the intelligence to stop him. The day of our final divorce settlement arrived with the suffocating humidity typical of a Georgia summer. I walked into the Fulton County Courthouse wearing a tailored crimson suit that commanded attention. I did not look like a defeated ex-wife. I looked like a woman who owned the room. When I entered the assigned arbitration chamber, the entire Davenport clan was already seated on the opposing side of the heavy mahogany table. Beatrice sat at the center draped in her usual Chanel, her lips pursed in a permanent scowl. Malcolm sat beside her, looking exhausted and avoiding my gaze. Bianca and Preston were there too, whispering to each other with smug expressions. They had brought their most expensive corporate shark of a lawyer, a man named Sterling, who looked at me like I was an insect he was about to squash. I took my seat next to my court-appointed attorney, a quiet woman who I had specifically instructed to let me do the talking when the time came. The mediator, an older judge with a no-nonsense demeanor, opened the folder in front of him. He noted that I had already signed the initial divorce decree, relinquishing all claims to the Davenport estate alimony and spousal support. The separation should have been cut and dry. Then Sterling leaned forward, sliding a massive stack of legal filings across the table. He cleared his throat loudly. "My client has an addendum to the settlement," Sterling announced, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have recently become aware that during the course of the marriage, Tessa utilized funds from the joint marital accounts to lease a private laboratory space. Furthermore, she developed a proprietary software algorithm during this time. Under Georgia law, any intellectual property created during the marriage using shared resources is considered a marital asset. The Davenport family is claiming full absolute ownership of this algorithm and all associated rights." I felt a cold smile fighting to break through my neutral expression. So they had finally figured it out. Preston must have gotten wind of the algorithm's potential value and convinced Beatrice it was the life raft they needed to save their sinking investment fund. Preston leaned over the table, his blue eyes flashing with greedy entitlement. "Let us not drag this out, Tessa," he sneered. "You were living under my mother-in-law's roof, eating her food and spending my brother-in-law's money, while you played on your computer. That code belongs to the Davenport empire. You do not have the resources or the business acumen to monetize it anyway. Hand over the hard drives, and maybe Beatrice will be generous enough to pay your legal parking fees today." Bianca laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the wood-paneled walls. "Honestly, you should be thanking us for taking that worthless project off your hands. It is the least you can do to repay Malcolm for putting up with a defective wife for 8 years. Malcolm finally looked up. He had the decency to look slightly ashamed, but he still nodded in agreement with his sister. "We need that software, Tessa," he said, his voice pathetic and weak. "It is the only fair way to settle this. You owe the family." "I owe you nothing," I said, my voice cutting through the room like a steel blade. The air in the chamber instantly dropped 10 degrees. Beatrice slammed her hand on the table. "Do not use that tone with us, you ungrateful wretch. You entered this family with nothing, and you will leave with nothing. The algorithm is ours. Sign the transfer documents immediately, or we will tie you up in litigation for the next decade. You will be bankrupt before the year is over." I slowly opened my leather briefcase. I pulled out a single thin folder and slid it across the table toward the mediator. I did not look at the Davenports. I kept my eyes locked on the judge. "Your Honor," I said calmly, "the opposing counsel's motion to seize the intellectual property is completely invalid. The asset they are referring to is no longer in my possession. It is not a marital asset, nor is it subject to division because it was legally sold prior to the filing of the divorce decree." Sterling let out a loud, mocking laugh. "Nice try," he scoffed. "Any sale of a marital asset made in anticipation of a divorce without the spouse's consent is considered fraudulent conveyance. We will simply have a judge void the sale and hold you in contempt. Who did you allegedly sell it to? A friend? A dummy corporation?" I slid a secondary document across the table, ensuring it landed right in front of Preston. "I sold it to an independent venture capitalist named Xavier," I replied, enunciating every syllable perfectly. "I transferred total ownership of the algorithm, the source code, and all future licensing rights to his firm." Beatrice snatched the paper from Preston's hands. Her eyes darted rapidly across the page, searching for a loophole. For how much, she demanded, her voice shrill with rising panic. "You cannot just give away a multi-million-dollar asset. How much did he pay you for it?" I leaned forward, clasping my hands together on the table. Exactly $1. The silence that descended upon the room was absolute. Sterling actually took off his glasses, rubbing his eyes as if he had misread the document. Preston's smug grin vanished, replaced by a look of utter horror. $1, Preston choked out. You sold a predictive financial algorithm that could save our entire fund for one single dollar. I did, I said, maintaining my icy composure. And because I sold it for $1, there are no significant financial proceeds to divide in this divorce settlement. The sale was executed 3 months before Beatrice threw those fake medical records in my face at the anniversary dinner. I had complete legal right to dispose of my own intellectual property as I saw fit. The transaction is ironclad, fully notarized, and completely legal. Sterling frantically flipped through the documents. He is right, Beatrice, the lawyer muttered, sweat beading on his forehead. The transfer predates the divorce filing by 90 days. It was a private sale of intellectual property developed entirely by her. There is no fraudulent conveyance because there was no pending divorce action at the time of the sale. We have no legal claim to it. Beatrice looked like she was going to have a stroke. Her face turned an alarming shade of purple. You vindictive, spiteful little nobody does this. You threw away millions of dollars just to keep it out of our hands. I did not throw anything away, Beatrice. I invested it with someone who actually knows how to build an empire without stealing from his own family, I said, looking pointedly at Preston. Xavier is launching a new financial tech firm next month. The algorithm is the cornerstone of his platform. I hear he already has secured $50 million in backing. It is a shame the Davenport Fund will not be able to compete with that kind of technological advantage. I suppose Malcolm will just have to figure out how to save your sinking ship the old-fashioned way. Malcolm looked physically ill. He slumped back in his chair, running a trembling hand over his face. We needed that, Tessa, he whispered. We really needed that. You needed a lot of things, Malcolm, I replied, my voice completely devoid of pity. Courage being the primary one. But you do not get to extract your salvation from the woman you threw away. The mediator cleared his throat, breaking the heavy tension. It appears the matter of the intellectual property is settled. The asset is not part of the marital estate. Unless there are further motions, I will finalize the divorce decree as initially signed. Sterling slammed his folder shut, defeated. No further motions, Your Honor. The proceedings wrapped up in minutes. The Davenports had come to the courthouse expecting to strip me down to the bone. Instead, they had been forced to watch their only lifeline float away, legally secured in the hands of a competitor. I gathered my things and walked out of the chamber. The hallway outside the courtroom was echoing with the sounds of other legal battles, but all I could hear was the frantic clicking of Beatrice's heels as she chased after me. You think you have won? She hissed, grabbing my shoulder and spinning me around. I casually brushed her hand off my jacket as if wiping away a piece of lint. I do not think anything, Beatrice. I know exactly what I have done. Bianca, Preston, and Malcolm caught up to her, standing like a wall of pathetic, desperate bullies. Beatrice's chest heaved with rage. Her perfectly styled hair seemed to be trembling with her fury. You sold your only asset for $1 just to spite us, Beatrice sneered, her voice echoing down the marble corridor. You are an absolute fool. You could have negotiated. You could have walked away with a piece of our wealth. Instead, you are walking out of here with nothing. You have no money. You have no family. You have no future. I stood perfectly still, letting her venom wash over me without absorbing a single drop of it. Look at you, Beatrice continued, her voice rising in volume, trying to attract the attention of passing lawyers and judges to humiliate me one last time. You are a barren, broken woman. You could not even give my son a child. You are a biological dead end. I promise you this, Tessa. A penniless, sterile nobody like you will never rise again in Atlanta. You will spend the rest of your pathetic life watching us succeed while you rot in the gutter. Malcolm looked away, too cowardly to even tell his own mother the truth about his sterility. Preston crossed his arms, trying to regain his arrogant posture while Bianca glared at me with absolute hatred. I let the silence stretch out for a long, agonizing moment. I looked at Beatrice, then at Malcolm, taking in their desperate need to make me feel small. They needed me to be broken so they could feel whole. I smiled. It was not a forced smile. It was a genuine, radiant expression of pure, unadulterated triumph. I reached down and gently rested my hand against my stomach right over my womb. Beatrice's ranting abruptly stopped. Her eyes dropped to my hand, and the color completely drained from her face for the second time that day. I did not say a single word. I did not need to. The way I held my stomach, the serene, glowing confidence in my eyes told them everything they needed to know. The medical records were fake. I was not the broken one. And the legacy I was building had absolutely nothing to do with their toxic, crumbling empire. I turned on my heel and walked down the marble hallway, my footsteps echoing with the steady, unbreakable rhythm of a woman who had just won the war. I left them standing there in the courthouse corridor, choking on the realization that their nightmare was only just beginning. The echo of my footsteps fading down the marble hallway of the courthouse was the beautiful sound of a closing chapter and the opening of a hunting season. The next 3 years were a masterclass in relentless reinvention and calculated growth. Xavier and I took that raw, predictive algorithm and forged it into Aegis. It was not just a financial technology platform, but a weapon of mass empowerment and a shield for those the traditional banking system had always ignored. We specifically designed the architecture of Aegis to identify, evaluate, and inject capital into promising African American businesses across Atlanta and the Greater South. We bypassed the old gatekeepers, the generational wealth funds that relied on outdated pedigree and racial exclusion to maintain their grip on the city. We worked 18-hour days in our new office space, analyzing massive data sets, securing independent backing from visionary investors, and building a network of absolute trust. Xavier was everything Malcolm had never been. He was a partner in the truest sense of the word, sharing the late nights, the stressful pitches, the coffee-stained blueprints, and the eventual breathtaking victories. He respected my intellect and protected my peace. As Aegis grew from a quiet laboratory startup into a financial titan, valued in the tens of millions, the Davenport Investment Fund began its slow, agonizing descent into ruin. Malcolm had finally gotten the chief executive officer title he had sacrificed me for. But a fancy nameplate on a mahogany desk cannot buy competence. Without my quiet guidance and the financial buffers I used to manage behind the scenes, his leadership was instantly disastrous. He made impulsive decisions driven by a desperate need to prove his mother right. He tried to emulate his late father's aggressive market tactics, but completely lacked the analytical intellect required to back them up. Worse, he gave Preston unrestricted access to the fund's capital reserves. Preston, the so-called aristocrat, was recklessly siphoning Davenport money into highly speculative offshore investments and underground gambling syndicates disguised as commercial real estate developments. The Davenport empire was bleeding out from a dozen self-inflicted wounds, and the sharks in Atlanta's elite circles were beginning to smell the blood in the water. But the most profound victory of those 3 years had absolutely nothing to do with market shares or venture capital acquisitions. It happened on a quiet Tuesday morning when I stared at a plastic wand on my bathroom counter and saw 2 solid pink lines. I remember falling to the tiled floor, gripping the edge of the sink, as tears of pure, overwhelming joy streamed down my face. For 8 agonizing years, I had been completely convinced my body was a barren wasteland. I had endured the vicious whispers at family dinners, the degrading medical appointments, the suffocating pity of a family that viewed me as a defective, broken machine. I had blamed myself for every negative test, but the life growing inside me proved that Beatrice's cruelty was nothing but a fragile, malicious lie designed to protect her genetically defective son. Xavier found me crying on the floor and held me close, promising that our child would never know the kind of toxic conditionality I had barely survived. 9 months later, I gave birth to our beautiful daughter, Aria. When the nurses placed her on my chest, wrapped in a soft white hospital blanket, I looked down at her thick, dark curls and perfect tiny fingers and felt a love so fierce it completely incinerated the trauma of my past. Arya was my living, breathing triumph. She was the absolute destruction of Beatrice's curse. Every time Arya laughed, every time she grabbed my finger with her tiny hand, the ghost of my former life lost another fraction of its power over me. I was a mother. I was a founder. I was whole. Meanwhile, Malcolm was sitting in a crumbling mansion, married to a legacy he could not sustain, holding on to a pride that was entirely fabricated. The desperation within the Davenport household was reaching a critical boiling point as the 3-year mark approached. I kept tabs on them through mutual acquaintances in the financial sector, observing their downfall with the clinical detachment of a scientist watching a failed experiment. Malcolm was drowning in a sea of red ink. The quarterly reports were disastrous, and their key legacy investors were threatening to pull their capital out of the fund entirely. Preston was becoming increasingly erratic, demanding more liquid cash to cover his failing ventures and threatening to leave Bianca if the family cut him off. Bianca remained willfully ignorant of the impending collapse, spending money they no longer possessed on lavish baby showers, luxury cars, and country club memberships, trying to keep up appearances. Beatrice was losing her iron grip on the high society she valued more than oxygen. The whispers at her charity luncheons were growing louder and more brazen. The elite families of Atlanta knew the Davenport Fund was on the verge of defaulting. In a state of absolute panic, Malcolm began searching the market for a lifeline. That was when he heard about Aegis. The industry rumors painted Aegis as a benevolent giant, an anonymous tech fund with massive capital reserves looking to acquire and stabilize struggling legacy portfolios. To Malcolm, it sounded like divine salvation. He did not know that the architect of this rising empire was the very woman he had discarded in a restaurant exactly 3 years ago. The financial circles were buzzing about the upcoming grand opening gala for the new Aegis headquarters in downtown Atlanta. It was the most coveted invitation in the city, a golden ticket to financial security. Malcolm knew that securing a partnership with Aegis was the only way to prevent the total collapse of the Davenport Fund. I knew from my industry contacts that he had begged Beatrice to leverage every ounce of her remaining social capital to get them through the door. He needed to meet the anonymous chief executive officer. He needed to beg for an injection of capital. Beatrice swallowed her pride and called in decades-old favors, cashing in every social debt she had left, just to secure a promise of entry to the gala. They were coming to my building desperate to kneel before a throne they did not realize I sat upon. The night of the grand opening arrived with the kind of electric energy that shifts the very atmosphere of a city. The new Aegis headquarters was a towering structure of glass and steel, a monument to modern innovation, an unyielding determination standing proudly in the center of the financial district. Searchlights swept across the dark Atlanta sky, and a plush red carpet stretched from the sleek revolving doors out to the valet station. Inside the main hall was transformed into a paradise of crystal lighting, modern art installations, and towering champagne pyramids. The most powerful investors, politicians, and business leaders in the South were mingling in the expansive lobby, eager to finally meet the secretive founders of Aegis. I stood in my private office on the top floor, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored white power suit. The fabric felt like armor. Xavier stood behind me, placing a gentle kiss on my shoulder before heading down to the main floor to coordinate the final stage preparations. I walked over to the massive wall of security monitors that overlooked the entire building. The high-definition screens displayed every angle of the lobby, the VIP lounges, and the entrance. My heart beat with a steady, calm rhythm. There was no anxiety left in my system, only the cold, absolute certainty of a predator waiting for the trap to snap shut. The heavy wooden door of my office clicked open, and my executive assistant stepped inside. She held an illuminated tablet in her hand, her expression a mix of professional annoyance and mild amusement. She looked up from the screen and met my eyes. "We have a situation at the main entrance," she reported, her voice crisp and clear over the quiet hum of the office. "A family claiming to be the Davenports is causing a significant disturbance at the security checkpoint." They are insisting they have a scheduled meeting with the chief executive officer, but their names are nowhere on the approved VIP guest list. They are refusing to step aside, and the matriarch is currently threatening to have our head of security fired for incompetence. I turned my attention back to the largest monitor on the wall. I zoomed in on the main lobby feed. There they were. Beatrice wearing a gown she probably could not afford anymore, her face twisted in an ugly mask of aristocratic entitlement as she berated a towering security guard. Malcolm stood beside her, looking frantic and sweaty, clutching a leather briefcase to his chest, like a life preserver. His eyes darted around the opulent lobby, taking in the sheer wealth of the company he was hoping to leech off of. Bianca and Preston were hovering behind them, looking equally indignant and desperate. They were shouting at my security team, pointing fingers, and demanding the respect they believed their family name still carried. I watched the screen as Beatrice stamped her foot, her mouth moving in angry, frantic shapes, demanding to speak to the manager. I let a slow, freezing smile spread across my face. "Let them wait," I told my assistant, my voice echoing softly in the quiet luxury of the office. "Let them panic for exactly 5 more minutes. Then instruct security to escort them inside. I want them exactly where they belong." I watched the security feed from the quiet sanctuary of my office, allowing the 5 minutes to tick by with agonizing slowness for the people trapped in the lobby below. On the high-definition monitor, I could see every bead of sweat forming on Malcolm's forehead. He was shifting his weight from foot to foot, clutching his leather briefcase as if it contained the cure to a terminal disease. In many ways it did. That briefcase held the desperate fabricated pitch decks he hoped would convince the anonymous chief executive officer of Aegis to pour millions into the dying Davenport investment fund. Beside him, Beatrice was putting on a theatrical display of aristocratic outrage. She jabbed her manicured finger into the chest of my head of security, a towering man named Marcus, who remained as immovable as a stone wall. Bianca and Preston hovered behind them, looking around the opulent lobby with wide, greedy eyes. I could see the exact moment the sheer wealth of my company intimidated them, but their deeply ingrained arrogance forced them to mask their awe with loud complaints about the service. When the 5 minutes were up, I turned away from the monitors and smoothed the lapels of my tailored white suit. I stepped out of my office and took the private executive elevator down to the ground floor. The glass doors slid open to reveal a symphony of high society elegance. The main hall of the Aegis headquarters was a masterpiece of modern architecture with soaring vaulted ceilings, indoor waterfalls, and ambient lighting that cast a warm golden glow over the hundreds of elite guests. Waiters glided silently through the crowd carrying trays of vintage champagne and caviar. Soft jazz floated through the air, blending with the low murmur of powerful people making lucrative deals. It was my world now, a world built on intellect and strategy, rather than empty bloodlines and fake prestige. I walked toward the main entrance, pausing to take a digital clipboard from one of my event coordinators to quickly review the catering schedule. As I stood there reviewing the digital notes, the commotion at the velvet ropes reached a fever pitch. Beatrice's voice pierced through the elegant atmosphere of the lobby, shrill and demanding. She was telling Marcus that she would personally see to it that he never worked in Atlanta again if he did not immediately unclip the rope and allow her family inside. Marcus simply crossed his massive arms over his chest, completely unbothered by her threats. He was waiting for my signal. I did not give it yet. I wanted to observe them up close. I wanted to see the people who had once crushed me under their designer shoes completely stripped of their power. It was Bianca who spotted me first. I saw her eyes dart past the security guards and land on my face. She blinked several times as if trying to process an impossible illusion. Then a cruel, familiar smirk twisted her features. She tapped her mother on the shoulder and pointed a perfectly manicured finger in my direction. Beatrice stopped her tirade and followed Bianca's gaze. The shock on my former mother-in-law's face was instantaneous, but it was quickly replaced by a look of absolute disgust. They pushed their way to the front of the barricade, ignoring the other guests who were politely waiting in line. Bianca leaned over the velvet rope, her eyes scanning my white suit and the digital clipboard in my hands. She let out a loud, grating laugh that made several nearby guests turn their heads in confusion. "Look who it is!" Bianca announced, her voice carrying a tone of vicious delight. I knew the service tonight was subpar, but I had no idea Aegis was hiring straight from the gutter. "What are you doing here, Tessa? Did they hire you to check coats, or are you just running errands for the real executives?" Beatrice let out a harsh scoff, adjusting the diamond necklace that was likely one of the few pieces she had not yet pawned to cover Preston's gambling debts. "It is absolutely shameful," Beatrice sneered loud enough for the security team to hear. "You build a magnificent building like this, and then you pollute the lobby with incompetent low-level staff. I suppose someone has to hold the guest list, but they could have at least hired a woman who knows how to properly present herself. It is no wonder there is a backup at the door. You are probably too slow to figure out how to operate that tablet." I stood perfectly still, holding the clipboard against my chest. I did not blink, I did not frown. I simply looked at them, letting their pathetic assumptions hang in the air. They were so blinded by their own prejudice and their desperate need to feel superior that they could not even comprehend the reality standing right in front of them. They saw a woman with a clipboard, and their minds immediately relegated her to the bottom of the social hierarchy because that was the only place they believed I belonged. Malcolm finally stepped forward. He looked worse up close. The stress of ruining his family's legacy had aged him a decade in 3 years. There were deep, dark bags under his eyes, and his suit hung loosely on his thinning frame. He looked at me with a mixture of panic and deep, profound embarrassment. He glanced around the lobby, nervously terrified that some wealthy investor might recognize me as his former wife and associate him with the hired help. "Tessa, what are you doing here?" Malcolm hissed, keeping his voice low as if trying to contain a scandalous secret. "This is a highly exclusive event. You have no business being out here where people can see you. If any of my colleagues or potential investors realize who you used to be to me, it will completely ruin my credibility. I am here to secure a massive partnership with the chief executive officer of this company, and I cannot have you wandering around the lobby making me look bad." Before I could even form a response, Malcolm reached into his breast pocket and pulled out a leather wallet. His fingers trembled slightly as he opened it. I could see that the thick stacks of cash he used to carry were gone, replaced by a few lonely bills and a collection of maxed-out credit cards. He pulled out a single, crumpled $100 bill. He reached across the velvet rope and practically shoved the money into my free hand. "Take this," Malcolm muttered, looking around frantically to ensure no one was watching his supposed act of charity. "Go take your break early. Go buy yourself a decent outfit or get some coffee and just hide in the back room until the gala is over. Just stay out of sight, Tessa. Please, do not ruin this night for me. I am begging you to just disappear." Preston leaned over Malcolm's shoulder, his arrogant smirk firmly in place, despite the fact that his terrible investments were the primary reason they were begging for money in the first place. "Listen to your former husband," Tessa, Preston drawled. "Take the handout. It is probably more money than you make in a week standing around holding that piece of plastic. Go find a dark corner and let the real players handle the business of the evening." I looked down at the $100 bill resting in my palm. It was worn at the edges, slightly damp from the nervous sweat of Malcolm's hands. 3 years ago, the gesture might have stung. It might have made me feel small and insignificant. But standing in the center of the empire I had built from the ground up, the money felt like nothing more than a piece of discarded trash. I did not throw the bill back in his face. I did not raise my voice or defend my position. I did not need to explain to a group of drowning fools that I owned the ocean they were desperately trying to swim in. Instead, I slowly and deliberately smoothed out the wrinkles in the $100 bill. I folded it neatly, precisely folding it in half, and then in quarters. I slid the folded bill into the front pocket of my pristine white blazer, patting it flat. I looked up and met Marcus's eyes. The massive head of security was watching the exchange with barely concealed rage. His jaw was clenched tight, and his hand was resting near his radio, ready to physically throw the entire Davenport family out onto the wet Atlanta pavement the second I gave the command. The surrounding security guards were equally tense, shifting their weight, waiting for my word. I held Marcus's gaze for a long, silent moment. Then I gave him a slow, subtle nod. "Stand down," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, absolute authority that cut through the noise of the lobby. Marcus immediately relaxed his posture. He stepped back from the barricade and unclipped the heavy brass hook of the velvet rope, letting it fall away to open the path. "Escort the Davenport family inside," I instructed the security team, my tone perfectly pleasant and completely professional. "Take them straight up to the most exclusive executive lounge on the VIP floor. They have a very important pitch to deliver tonight, and we would not want to keep them waiting." Beatrice let out a loud, triumphant sigh, instantly assuming that my command was a terrified submission to her authority. She adjusted her diamond necklace and smoothed the front of her gown, her chest puffing out with overwhelming arrogance. She looked at the security guards with utter contempt before turning her victorious gaze back to me. "That is exactly what I thought," Beatrice proclaimed, a smug, venomous smile stretching across her face. "It is good to see you finally understand your place, Tessa. You may be working in a fancy building now, but the Davenport name still commands absolute obedience in this city. Next time, try to remember who your betters are before you force us to make a scene in public. Now get out of our way. We have a meeting with the leader of this company." She stepped forward, pushing past me without a second glance. Malcolm followed closely behind, clutching his briefcase tighter, looking visibly relieved that the hired help had finally decided to cooperate. Bianca bumped her shoulder against mine as she walked past, letting out a soft, mocking laugh. Preston swaggered through the opening, tossing a condescending wink in my direction as he followed the security guards toward the private elevators. They walked through the grand lobby of my company, completely ignoring me, now whispering excitedly to each other about their brilliant pitch decks and the millions of dollars they were about to secure from the anonymous genius who ran Aegis. They marched onto the plush carpets of the VIP elevator, their heads held high, completely blinded by their own magnificent delusion. They had absolutely no idea that the exclusive executive lounge they were being escorted into was not a sanctuary for negotiation. They had no idea they were walking straight into a perfectly constructed trap, stepping willingly onto the platform of a guillotine that I had spent the last 3 years building. I stood in the lobby watching the golden elevator doors slide shut, locking them inside. I adjusted the clipboard in my hand, a cold, satisfied smile finally touching my lips as I turned to follow them up to the slaughter. The private elevator glided smoothly to the top floor of the Aegis headquarters, carrying the Davenport family directly into the heart of my domain. When the golden doors slid open, they stepped into the most exclusive lounge in the entire building. The room was a breathtaking display of modern luxury, featuring panoramic views of the Atlanta skyline. Dark velvet furnishings and walls adorned with digital displays, showing real-time global market analytics. A private bar carved from a single piece of black marble anchored the space, staffed by attendants pouring champagne that cost more than Malcolm's current monthly operating budget. Preston wasted absolutely no time. The moment he entered the room, he spotted a cluster of wealthy venture capitalists standing near the floor-to-ceiling windows. Ignoring the fact that he was essentially bankrupt, Preston adjusted his expensive suit jacket and strutted over to them with the unearned swagger of a man who believed his bloodline made him invincible. He immediately began boasting loudly about the Davenport family legacy, throwing around bloated financial terms and acting as if he were already an intimate partner in the Aegis empire. He laughed too loudly, patted powerful men on the back, and spoke of his vast portfolio, completely oblivious to the fact that the men he was trying to impress were actually members of my advisory board. They knew exactly who he was, and they knew exactly why his family was about to lose everything. I watched this pathetic charade from the hallway for a moment, before deciding it was time to make my final preparations. I stepped into the lounge, holding a digital tablet to review the audio frequencies for the main stage presentation. My white power suit was perfectly tailored, but I had slipped a discreet communication headset over one ear to coordinate with Xavier and the event staff. To someone blinded by their own arrogance, I suppose I simply looked like a high-level event coordinator, making sure the wealthy guests were comfortable. I walked directly past Preston and his captive audience to inspect a small audio podium set up in the corner of the room. Preston caught sight of me out of the corner of his eye. Instead of showing a shred of humility or even basic human decency, he rolled his eyes dramatically. He deliberately turned his back to me, leaning in to speak to the board members. He raised his voice, making sure his cruel words carried across the quiet hum of the lounge. He complained bitterly about the terrible service in Atlanta, whining that good help was impossible to find, and that the event staff here looked like they had been dragged in from the street. He was trying to humiliate me, trying to assert his dominance over the woman his family had discarded. Bianca, who was sipping champagne nearby, laughed in agreement, loudly insulting my presence. She whispered to her mother that it was embarrassing for Aegis to hire a disgraced, penniless ex-wife to run errands at such an elite gathering. They assumed I was a servant. They assumed the absolute worst because that was the only reality their fragile egos could tolerate. I did not react. I calmly adjusted the microphone settings, tapped a confirmation code into my tablet, and walked out of the room without giving them a single glance. Their ignorance was the final nail in their coffin. An hour later, a soft chime echoed through the building, signaling that the main event was about to begin. The attendees in the lounge were ushered down a grand, sweeping staircase into the primary ballroom. The space was cavernous and spectacular, designed to intimidate and inspire. A massive stage occupied the front of the room, backed by towering digital screens displaying the sleek, minimalist logo of our company. The Davenport family moved with desperate, aggressive purpose. Beatrice elbowed her way past genuine philanthropists and respected industry leaders, determined to claim a spot at the very front of the crowd. Malcolm followed closely behind her, his face slick with nervous sweat. He was gripping his leather briefcase so tightly, his knuckles were completely white. Inside that briefcase was the pathetic, fabricated pitch deck he believed would save his family from financial ruin. He needed the anonymous tech genius behind Aegis to grant him a miracle. He stared at the empty stage, his eyes wide and hungry, waiting for his savior to appear. The lights in the grand ballroom slowly dimmed. The ambient chatter of the crowd faded into a hush of anticipation. A powerful orchestral track began to play, the music swelling with a triumphant cinematic intensity that vibrated through the floorboards. Xavier stepped out from the wings and walked to the center of the stage. He looked magnificent, projecting the kind of calm, effortless authority that Malcolm had spent his entire life trying to fake. Xavier gripped the microphone and smiled at the sea of powerful faces. He began his speech talking about the urgent need to disrupt a stagnant financial system built on exclusion and old money prejudices. He spoke about breaking down the barriers that kept minority-owned businesses starved of capital. He praised the brilliant architecture of the predictive algorithm that powered our platform, calling it a masterpiece of modern financial technology. Down in the front row, Malcolm was practically vibrating with anxiety. He leaned forward, hanging on to every single word Xavier spoke, preparing himself to beg for the family business. Beatrice stood beside him, her chin raised high, ready to deploy her aristocratic charm the moment the true founder was revealed. Then Xavier stepped back from the microphone. He raised his hand and announced that it was time for the world to meet the true visionary, the architect of the algorithm, and the sole chief executive officer of Aegis. The music reached a thundering crescendo. A brilliant white spotlight snapped on, sweeping across the dark stage and landing directly on the heavy velvet curtains at the back. The curtains parted. I walked out. The stark white of my suit caught the brilliant light illuminating me against the dark backdrop. I walked to the center of the stage with slow, deliberate steps, projecting absolute, unshakable power. The room exploded. The investors, the tech leaders, the board members who had been working with me in secret for 3 years all rose to their feet. A deafening roar of applause and a standing ovation thundered through the massive ballroom, echoing off the glass walls. I looked down at the very front row. Beatrice was holding a crystal glass of red wine. Her eyes locked onto mine, and the arrogant mask she had worn for decades violently shattered. She stared at the woman she had called a broken machine, a barren waste of space, a penniless nobody. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. All the strength left her body. Her fingers went completely limp. The crystal glass slipped from her hand and crashed onto the polished marble floor, shattering into 100 pieces. The dark red wine splashed across her expensive shoes, looking exactly like blood. Bianca physically recoiled, her jaw dropping so far open it looked painful. The smug superiority she had carried all evening evaporated, leaving behind nothing but raw terror. Preston took a stumbling step backward, looking as if all the oxygen had been vacuumed out of his lungs. And Malcolm. Malcolm was completely paralyzed. His mouth trembled. The leather briefcase containing his desperate plea for salvation slipped from his sweaty grip and hit the floor with a heavy thud. He stared up at me, his eyes wide with the horrifying realization that the anonymous genius he had come to beg from the savior of his entire crumbling empire was the very woman he had thrown away to please his mother. I did not blink. I did not offer them a single ounce of recognition or pity. I turned my gaze out to the cheering crowd. I grasped the edges of the podium and leaned into the microphone. My voice rang out clear and cold, silencing the applause, as I officially welcomed the world to the new era of the Aegis Investment Fund. Every word I spoke about building a future based on merit and integrity was a deliberate, calculated strike against the corrupt legacy the Davenports represented. I outlined our mission, our capital reserves, and our unwavering commitment to destroying outdated financial gatekeepers. As I finished my closing remarks, the room erupted into cheers once again. Camera flashes strobed blindly across the stage, documenting the birth of a new financial titan. Down on the floor, the reality of his total destruction finally broke through Malcolm's paralysis. He realized that the doors to high society were slamming shut in his face, and the only person holding the keys was standing above him. Panic entirely consumed his humiliation. He abandoned his mother and shoved his sister aside. He violently pushed his way through the crowd of wealthy investors, knocking a media photographer out of his path. He scrambled to the very edge of the stage, pressing himself against the security barricade. The media cameras immediately pivoted, sensing the sudden, desperate commotion. Seeing the lenses focusing on him, Malcolm's demeanor shifted with sickening speed. He dropped heavily to his knees, gripping the metal barricade with white knuckles. He looked up at me, his face contorted in a mask of manufactured agony. He shouted my name over the roar of the crowd, letting out a ragged, pathetic sob. He began pleading for forgiveness, loudly declaring his undying love and begging his beautiful, brilliant wife to take him back, hoping to use the flashing cameras to trap me in a corner of public sympathy. The flashing cameras illuminated Malcolm as he knelt against the cold metal barricade, his face slick with a desperate manufactured sweat. The sheer force of his panic had completely overridden any lingering shred of his aristocratic pride. He realized with horrifying clarity that the woman he had discarded like trash was now holding the absolute power to either save his crumbling family legacy or let it drown in a sea of public bankruptcy. He knew he had only seconds to control the narrative before the hundreds of powerful investors and journalists in the room realized the true nature of our history. Malcolm lunged forward, leaning over the barricade, and violently snatched a microphone from the hands of a startled financial reporter who was standing in the front row. The sudden movement caused a sharp, piercing whine of audio feedback to echo through the massive ballroom, forcing several guests to cover their ears. Malcolm ignored the screeching audio and gripped the microphone with both hands, raising it to his mouth. His voice boomed across the cavernous space, echoing off the glass walls and silencing the murmurs of the crowd. "Tessa!" He shouted, his voice dripping with a pathetic, trembling theatricality. "Tessa, please, you have to listen to me." He pulled himself up slightly, leaning heavily against the barricade, casting his eyes downward to project an image of profound remorse. The entire ballroom fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The elite members of Atlanta society, the venture capitalists, and the media all watched in absolute fascination as the heir to the Davenport fortune publicly begged the anonymous chief executive officer of Aegis. "We were a team once." Tessa Malcolm pleaded his words carefully, chosen to manipulate the audience. He was weaponizing the media, hoping to trap me in a corner of public sympathy. "We built a beautiful life together for 8 years. I know our separation was painful. I know the divorce was a tragic, terrible misunderstanding born from the immense crushing pressure of our industry. But I have never stopped thinking about you. I have never stopped caring for you." I stood perfectly still at the center of the grand stage, looking down at the man I had once promised to spend my life with. The sheer audacity of his lies was almost breathtaking. A tragic misunderstanding. He was casually reframing a coordinated public humiliation and a relentless campaign of emotional abuse as a simple failure of communication. He was relying on the societal expectation that a successful woman should be nurturing, forgiving, and eager to repair a broken home. "You have built something truly magnificent here," Tessa Malcolm continued, his voice rising with a desperate pleading cadence. "You have proven your brilliance to the entire world. But you do not have to do this alone anymore. The Davenport family has always recognized your potential. Our doors have always remained open for your return. We can unite our visions. We can bring the Davenport Investment Fund and Aegis together to create an unstoppable financial partnership. Please, Tessa, let us heal the past. Let us merge our empires and move forward as the family we were always meant to be." He lowered the microphone, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes. He had played the role of the remorseful, loving ex-husband to absolute perfection. A low murmur rippled through the crowd of investors. Some nodded in approval, clearly moved by his public display of vulnerability. They did not know the monster that lurked beneath his tailored suit. They did not know about the forged medical records, the stolen money, or the vicious cruelty of his mother. To them, this was a beautiful opportunity for a corporate merger wrapped in a romantic reconciliation. I looked past Malcolm and saw Beatrice standing a few feet away. Her chest was heaving, her face a mask of shock and furious calculation. She was horrified that her son was kneeling before a woman she considered to be a peasant. But she was also desperate enough to realize that his pathetic display was their only chance at survival. Preston and Bianca stood frozen, watching the scene unfold with terrified wide eyes. I did not raise my voice. I did not scream at him or call him a liar. I simply stared at him, letting the heavy, suffocating silence stretch out. I was preparing to dismantle his entire fabricated narrative piece by piece when a sudden, delicate sound cut through the heavy atmosphere of the grand ballroom. It was a light, rapid tapping sound completely out of place in a room filled with corporate titans and cutthroat investors. It was the unmistakable rhythmic patter of small shoes running across the polished mahogany floor of the backstage area. Before I could even turn my head, the heavy velvet curtains behind me parted, and the illusion of Malcolm's tragic love story was instantly violently shattered. Out from the shadows of the wings ran Arya. My beautiful 3-year-old daughter stepped into the blinding glare of the stage lights. She was wearing a delicate blush pink dress with a ruffled tulle skirt and tiny white patent leather shoes. Her thick dark curls bounced around her face, framing eyes that were a perfect, brilliant reflection of Xavier's intelligence and warmth. She was completely oblivious to the hundreds of powerful strangers staring up at the stage. She did not care about the flashing cameras, the tense silence, or the high-stakes corporate drama unfolding in the room. She only saw me. Mommy, Arya shouted, her high, sweet voice ringing out clearly across the stage and carrying through the nearest microphone. She ran across the polished floor, her little arms outstretched, her face lit up with an innocent, radiant joy. She crashed into my legs, wrapping her small arms tightly around my knees, burying her face in the crisp white fabric of my trousers. I immediately dropped my professional posture. I knelt down on the stage, completely ignoring the fact that I was in front of the most powerful financial leaders in the country. I wrapped my arms around her tiny body, pressing a kiss to her soft curls and inhaling the sweet, familiar scent of lavender and baby shampoo. "I got you, my sweet girl," I whispered, gently rubbing her back. A collective synchronized gasp rippled through the massive ballroom. The flashing of the camera lenses escalated into a blinding, frenzied storm. The media realized instantly that the narrative had just fundamentally shifted. Malcolm was still kneeling at the barricade, the borrowed microphone dangling loosely from his hand. His mouth hung open in an expression of absolute paralyzed confusion. He stared at the little girl clinging to my legs, his brain completely unable to process the biological impossibility of what he was witnessing. For 8 years, he had allowed his mother to convince the world and me that I was an empty, barren vessel. He had thrown me away because I supposedly could not provide him with a legacy. And now he was staring at a living, breathing, perfectly healthy child who called me mother. The shock held the room hostage for only a few fleeting seconds before the undeniable reality of Arya's existence completely fractured Beatrice's mind. The matriarch of the Davenport family could not accept this. She could not process the fact that the woman she had publicly degraded and discarded as a biological failure had effortlessly produced a child. Her entire reality, her lifelong superiority complex, was unraveling in real time. Beatrice let out a guttural, unhinged scream that echoed terribly through the elegant room. She shoved her way past the bewildered investors, her expensive heels slipping on the spilled red wine from her shattered glass. She threw herself against the metal barricade right beside her paralyzed son, her face contorted into a mask of purple, pulsing fury. "She is a liar!" Beatrice shrieked, her voice raw and shrill, tearing through the shocked silence of the ballroom. "Do not believe a single word this woman says. She is a complete fraud." Beatrice pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at me and then at the little girl hiding her face against my shoulder. Arya whimpered slightly at the loud, aggressive noise, and I pulled her closer, shielding her from the absolute toxicity radiating from the front row. "That child is a fake!" Beatrice screamed, spittle flying from her lips as she completely lost her grip on her aristocratic sanity. "She is a hired actor. This is a pathetic, elaborate stunt designed to humiliate my family. I know the truth about you, Tessa. You are biologically barren. You are an empty, useless machine. You were kicked out of my prestigious home because you are physically incapable of reproducing. You are sterile. That child cannot possibly be yours." The investors and journalists stared at Beatrice in absolute horror. The elegant, poised woman who had dictated Atlanta high society for decades was currently screaming like a lunatic, acting like a desperate, cornered animal. Preston tried to grab her arm to pull her away from the cameras, but Beatrice violently shoved him backward, refusing to break her deranged stare. "She hired that child to save face." Beatrice continued shouting into the crowd, trying desperately to convince the disgusted onlookers. "She is trying to pretend she has a perfect life, but she is broken. She is a biological dead end. Do not invest your money with a woman who has to buy a fake family to hide her own shameful deficiencies." Malcolm finally seemed to snap out of his trance. He looked at his mother, his face pale and slick with sweat, realizing that her unhinged screaming was destroying whatever tiny microscopic chance they had left of securing a partnership. "Mother, stop," he whispered weakly, tugging at her sleeve. But Beatrice was too far gone, trapped in the defensive delusion she had created 8 years ago. I remained kneeling on the stage, my arms wrapped protectively around Arya. I looked down at my beautiful daughter, gently stroking her dark curls and murmuring soft, reassuring words to calm her. When she looked up at me with her bright, trusting eyes, I smiled. I felt a profound, absolute serenity wash over my entire body. The screaming woman at the barricade could not touch us. Her venom meant absolutely nothing. I slowly stood back up, resting one hand gently on Arya's shoulder. I looked down at Beatrice, whose chest was heaving with exertion, her face twisted in an ugly, desperate sneer. I looked at Malcolm, who was shrinking away from the blinding camera flashes, entirely defeated by his own cowardice. The icy, triumphant smile returned to my face. I did not scream back at Beatrice. I did not raise my voice to defend my daughter's existence or explain my medical history to a crowd of strangers. Words were completely unnecessary when you held the absolute undeniable truth in the palm of your hand. I looked up from the pathetic display at the barricade and shifted my gaze toward the back of the massive auditorium. High above the crowd, suspended in a glass-enclosed observation deck, sat the technical production team. I raised my free hand and gave a single subtle sharp signal to the lead technician. The massive, towering LED screen behind me, which had been projecting the bright minimalist logo of the Aegis Investment Fund, suddenly went completely pitch black. The sudden loss of light caused a momentary hush to fall over the panicked, chaotic ballroom. The investors, the media, and even Beatrice fell silent, instinctively turning their attention to the looming darkness of the giant screen. The room collectively held its breath, the air heavy and thick with electric anticipation. They were preparing to witness the final, absolute destruction of the Davenport empire. I squeezed Arya's small hand, continuing to smile my cold, unshakable smile as the massive screen clicked and began to change its display, preparing to broadcast the ultimate unarguable truth to the entire world. The massive lead screen behind me hummed to life, casting a brilliant blue and white glow over the dark stage and washing over the faces of the hundreds of guests in the ballroom. I kept my hand firmly on Arya's shoulder, looking down at the very front row where the Davenport family was completely frozen in anticipation. The pitch-black display suddenly shattered into light, revealing a highly magnified, high-definition scan of an official medical document. The seal of the Atlanta Central Hospital was printed clearly at the top of the page. The document was dated exactly 8 years ago. The date matched the exact month that Beatrice had coldly informed me I was a barren, defective woman who had no place in her prestigious family. My name was printed clearly across the patient information section. The medical terminology on the screen was complex, filled with diagnostic codes and physician notes, but the final conclusion was highlighted in a bright, unmistakable yellow block of text. The words were blown up so large that even the people standing at the very back of the ballroom could read them perfectly. The report stated unequivocally that my reproductive system was perfectly healthy. It confirmed that my hormone levels were optimal and that there was absolutely no biological or genetic reason I could not naturally conceive and bear children. A wave of confused murmurs rippled through the audience. The powerful investors and tech magnates whispered to each other, trying to understand why the chief executive officer of Aegis was projecting her personal medical records during a massive corporate launch. But the people in the front row, the old money families of Atlanta, who knew the Davenport history, knew exactly what this meant. Beatrice let out a strange, strangled gasp. Her manicured hands flew to her throat. She stared up at the bright screen, her eyes wide with unadulterated panic. She knew what was coming next. Before anyone could even fully process the implications of the first document, I raised my hand and gave another subtle signal to the production booth. The screen flickered and the medical certificate was instantly replaced by a different kind of document. This time, it was a certified bank statement retrieved from a highly secure offshore account. The sender on the wire transfer was listed clearly as the Davenport Family Legacy Trust, with Beatrice Davenport named as the sole authorizing signatory. The recipient of the transfer was Dr. Arthur Pendleton. He was the so-called trusted family physician, the highly respected medical professional who had sat across from me in a sterile office 8 years ago and delivered the devastating fake diagnosis that ruined my life. The amount of the wire transfer was printed in bold black ink: $250,000. The transaction had been completed just 3 days before my supposed medical results were delivered to the family. The memo line on the transfer simply read, "For medical discretion." The quiet murmurs in the ballroom instantly escalated into a roar of collective shock and disgusted realization. Camera shutters fired like rapid machine guns. Financial journalists were frantically typing the details into their phones, realizing they had just stumbled onto the biggest scandal in the history of Southern high society. The elite families of Atlanta, The very people Beatrice had spent her entire life trying to impress and manipulate were now staring at her as if she were a literal monster. The evidence was completely irrefutable. Beatrice Davenport had paid a doctor $250,000 to falsify my medical records. She had paid to convince me that I was a broken, useless woman. She had orchestrated a horrific psychological trauma just so she could justify throwing me out of her family and finding a more suitable aristocratic wife for her son. The sheer calculated malice of the crime left the entire room completely breathless. But I was not finished. I had spent 3 years building this exact moment, and I was going to make sure there was nothing left of their toxic empire. I looked down at Malcolm. He was staring at the bank statement, his mouth hanging open, struggling to comprehend the depth of his mother's betrayal. I signaled the tech crew one last time. The screen flickered again and a second medical report appeared. This document was also dated exactly 8 years ago. This report belonged to Malcolm Davenport. The results displayed on the screen were stark, uncompromising, and absolutely devastating. It detailed a severe, irreversible genetic condition. The medical conclusion highlighted in glaring red text was absolute. Malcolm Davenport was completely sterile. He had a 0% chance of ever naturally fathering a biological child. His condition was profound and permanent. The silence that fell over the grand ballroom this time was entirely different. It was a heavy, oppressive, suffocating silence. The air was sucked out of the room. The eyes of Atlanta's entire elite class slowly turned away from the massive LED screen and locked directly onto Malcolm. The men in the room, the powerful venture capitalists, the banking magnates, and the industry leaders stared at him with a brutal mixture of shock and quiet pity. Malcolm's entire identity was built on his projection of masculine authority and patriarchal dominance. His meticulously crafted image of a powerful, virile leader was ground into dust in front of the entire world. His male pride, the very foundation of his fragile ego, was completely and totally incinerated in the span of 30 seconds. Malcolm stood frozen, staring up at his own medical records. His face was completely devoid of color, looking like gray wax under the bright stage lights. His hands were shaking so violently that he had to grip the metal security barricade just to keep his knees from buckling. His chest heaved as he struggled to pull air into his lungs. He had spent the last 8 years believing that I was the defective one. He had divorced me, discarded me, and treated me with absolute contempt because he truly believed I could not give him an heir to carry on his prestigious name. He never knew the truth. He never knew that he was the one who was biologically incapable of continuing the Davenport bloodline. He never knew because his own mother had hidden the test results from him, paying off a corrupt doctor to destroy my life just to protect her son's pathetic, fragile pride. The psychological destruction happening in the front row was absolute. Malcolm slowly turned his head to look at Beatrice. His eyes were hollow dark and filled with a raw, agonizing rage that seemed to shatter his very soul. He let go of the metal barricade and took a slow, trembling step toward the woman who had controlled every single aspect of his existence since the day he was born. Beatrice shrank back under his terrifying gaze. She raised her hands defensively, her aristocratic poise completely obliterated by fear and exposure. She looked like a cornered rat. She began to stammer, her voice trembling and weak, as she desperately tried to justify the unforgivable crime she had committed against him and against me. "Malcolm, please," she whimpered, stepping backward as her son advanced on her. "You have to understand. I only did it to protect you. I did it for the family." She tried to explain her twisted logic to him, right there in front of the flashing cameras. She said she could not bear the thought of the Davenport heir feeling inadequate or humiliated in front of his peers. She claimed that a man in his position, a man destined to rule a financial empire, needed absolute, unshakable confidence. She reasoned that knowing he was sterile would have broken his spirit and ruined his potential. She told him she paid the doctor to switch our results because it was easier for the world to accept a barren wife than a defective patriarch. Then, with a level of breathtaking delusion that almost defied human comprehension, Beatrice actually tried to shift the blame back onto me. She pointed her shaking manicured finger at the stage, screaming over the murmurs of the crowd. She yelled that if I had just been a better wife, if I had just accepted my dismissal quietly and kept the family secrets buried in the dark, none of this would be happening. She screamed that I was a vindictive monster who was destroying a legacy by airing their private medical history to the public. She demanded that Malcolm take her side, insisting that they needed to stand together to protect the Davenport name from my malicious attacks. But Malcolm did not care about her twisted logic or her desperate pleas for family unity. The realization that his mother had deliberately robbed him of his marriage, his happiness, and his entire future completely snapped his mind. The illusion of the perfect Davenport family crumbled into ash. He lunged forward, ignoring the gasps of the surrounding investors. He grabbed Beatrice by the shoulders, shaking her violently. His voice tore through the ballroom, raw and agonizing. "You ruined me!" he screamed right into her face, spittle flying from his lips. "You destroyed my life. You made me throw away the only woman who ever truly loved me. You made me hate her for something she never did." Malcolm wept openly, sobbing in front of the media cameras, completely abandoning his pristine corporate image. He cursed his mother for turning him into a hollow, empty shell of a man, living a total lie that had ultimately led to their financial and social ruin. He realized that if he had just stayed with me, if he had just accepted the truth, and let me guide his business, they would not be facing bankruptcy. He screamed that her toxic obsession with bloodlines and pedigree had killed the only good thing he ever had. He released her shoulders, pushing her away with so much force that Beatrice stumbled backward and fell hard onto the marble floor, her expensive gown soaking up the spilled red wine. The powerful investors and journalists watched in absolute morbid fascination as the Davenport family tore itself to pieces. The security guards stepped closer, ready to intervene, but I held up my hand, keeping them at bay. I wanted the world to see this. I wanted every person in that room to witness the total collapse of the false idols they had worshipped for decades. The situation was entirely out of control. The media cameras were capturing every second of the spectacular meltdown, broadcasting the end of an era. Beatrice was crying on the floor, trying to pull herself up, while her son continued to scream at her. The once mighty Davenport empire was officially dead, buried under the crushing weight of its own toxic secrets and unforgivable lies. But Bianca always, the desperate blind opportunist, refused to accept defeat. She could not stand the thought of losing her social standing and slipping into poverty. She looked around at the disgusted faces of the wealthy investors and realized that the Davenport name was now completely worthless in Atlanta. No one would ever do business with a sterile failure and a mother who committed medical fraud. Her brain scrambled for any possible lifeline, any thread of status she could cling to. Pushing past her sobbing mother and her broken, completely destroyed brother, Bianca grabbed her husband by the arm. She pulled Preston violently to the front of the barricade, thrusting him into the harsh glare of the stage lights. She raised her chin, trying to project a defiant, arrogant energy that was completely unearned and entirely pathetic given the circumstances. She shouted over the commotion, her voice shrill and panicked, demanding the attention of the media. She bragged loudly to the surrounding elite that the Davenports were not finished yet. She proudly declared that at least the family lineage still had her beautiful son carrying their bloodline into the future. She pointed at Preston, boasting to the room that they still had the massive, endless financial backing of his incredibly wealthy white family. She screamed at me, her face red with exertion, declaring that Preston's massive trust fund and his powerful aristocratic connections would single-handedly rebuild their empire. She promised the cameras that her husband's family money would crush my little tech company into the ground and restore the Davenports to their rightful place at the top of the social hierarchy. She clung to Preston's arm, waiting for him to support her desperate claims, completely unaware that the ground beneath her feet was already gone. Bianca clung to Preston's arm, her voice a shrill, desperate shriek that bounced off the glass walls of the massive ballroom. She was screaming about his massive trust fund and his powerful aristocratic connections, promising anyone who would listen that his wealthy white family would crush my company and restore the Davenports to their rightful place at the top of Atlanta society. I stood on the stage holding my beautiful daughter gently against my side, and I listened to her pathetic delusions. The entire room of venture capitalists, philanthropists, and media personnel watched her in a state of stunned disbelief. Preston stood beside her, puffing out his chest and trying to maintain his disguise of old money superiority. But from my vantage point on the stage, I could see the tiny beads of sweat forming along his hairline and the way his eyes darted nervously around the room. He knew his masquerade was running out of time and he was terrified. I did not yell back at Bianca. I did not try to argue with her frantic claims or defend my position. Instead, a low, genuine laugh escaped my lips. The sound of my laughter, magnified by the stage microphone, washed over the silent ballroom, cold and echoing. It was the calm, unshakable laugh of a woman who held every single winning card in the deck and was simply waiting for the right moment to lay them on the table. I looked down at Preston, watching the fake confidence completely drain from his eyes. "You think this man is your savior?" I asked, my voice smooth and lethal, slicing through the tense atmosphere. "You think his bloodline is going to rescue you from the consequences of your own breathtaking incompetence?" I raised the small remote in my hand and clicked the button one more time. The massive LED screen behind me shifted instantly. The devastating medical records that had just destroyed Malcolm vanished entirely, replaced by a blinding flurry of legal documents, federal court filings, and harsh red bankruptcy stamps. The collective gasp from the audience was even louder this time, rippling through the elite crowd like a physical shockwave. Projected on the screen in 50-foot letters was the absolute, undeniable destruction of Preston's fabricated identity. The documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that his supposedly untouchable old money dynasty had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy exactly 10 years ago. His family had lost absolutely everything. The sprawling estates, the liquid assets, the generational trust funds had all been seized and liquidated by federal banks. They were entirely penniless, living on the ghost of a reputation that no longer existed. Preston was not a wealthy aristocrat coming to elevate the Davenport name. He was a professional con artist, a highly skilled parasite wearing the hollow disguise of white nobility to prey on desperate status-obsessed fools exactly like Beatrice and Bianca. I watched Preston's face turn the color of wet ash. The arrogant swagger he had paraded around my lobby just an hour ago evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a terrified, desperate grifter who had finally been caught in the light. The whispers in the ballroom grew into a loud, chaotic murmur as the wealthiest people in the South realized they were standing in the same room as a notorious fraud. But I was not finished tearing him apart. The destruction of his social standing was only the beginning of my vengeance. I clicked the remote again. The screen transitioned smoothly from bankruptcy filings to a series of highly classified bank statements and international wire transfer logs. I had spent months using my algorithm to track these digital footprints, completely dismantling the complex financial maze Preston thought he had so cleverly constructed. I spoke into the microphone, my voice ringing with clinical precision as I explained the depth of his betrayal. I told Beatrice to look closely at the screen. I told her to look at the man she had welcomed into her home, the man she had trusted implicitly over her own family simply because he possessed the right pedigree and the right skin color. The bank logs showed a relentless, devastating series of wire transfers moving millions of dollars directly from the Davenport family legacy fund into offshore shell companies located in Cyprus and the Cayman Islands. Every single one of those anonymous shell companies traced directly back to Preston. He had brilliantly exploited Beatrice's blind trust and her absolute desperation to maintain her position in high society. She had given him unrestricted access to the family reserves, blindly signing authorizations because she truly believed he was using his superior aristocratic knowledge to invest their wealth in lucrative commercial real estate. Instead, he was draining their accounts completely dry. He was not building a future for the Davenports. He was using their generational wealth to pay off his own massive, dangerous debts to underground gambling syndicates. The truth hung heavy over the room. He had bled the Davenport family for every last cent. They were completely broke, entirely destitute because they had handed the keys to their kingdom to a smiling thief. The reality of the situation crashed down on the front row with the force of a collapsing building. The Davenport family was not just struggling to maintain their fund, they were completely, absolutely bankrupt, and the man standing right beside them was the one who had driven the final knife into their backs. Bianca stared up at the screen, her eyes darting frantically over the offshore account numbers and the undeniable mathematical proof of her husband's treachery. Her mouth opened and closed as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. The glamorous elite life she thought she was living, the superiority she felt over me, it was all pure, unadulterated garbage. She had sold her soul for a fake title and an empty bank account. Something inside Bianca finally snapped. The delicate, poised socialite completely lost her mind right in front of the flashing cameras. She let out a piercing, guttural shriek that sounded more animal than human and turned on Preston. She threw herself at him, her manicured hands turning into violent claws as she attacked the man who had ruined her life. She hit his chest, tearing at the lapels of his expensive suit, the very suit that was likely paid for with her family's stolen money. She was crying and screaming incoherently, calling him a monster, a thief, a disgusting piece of trash. She slapped at his face, her perfect hair falling in wild tangles around her shoulders as she completely surrendered to her rage and humiliation. Beatrice, who was still sitting on the floor covered in spilled wine, simply stared into space, her mind completely broken by the absolute destruction of everything she valued. The legacy she had sacrificed me to protect was gone, stolen by the very man she had championed. Malcolm remained frozen, staring at his sister and his brother-in-law, unable to comprehend that his mother had destroyed his marriage for nothing, and his sister had married a con man who destroyed their wealth. The room was in total, absolute chaos. The elite guests watched the physical altercation with a mixture of disgust and morbid fascination. Preston stumbled backward under the weight of Bianca's frantic, brutal attack. His mask of gentlemanly charm was entirely gone, replaced by a vicious, animalistic panic. He raised his hands not to calm his hysterical wife, but to violently defend himself. With a harsh, brutal movement, Preston shoved Bianca away from him. He pushed her with so much forceful aggression that she flew backward, her high heels slipping on the polished floor. She crashed hard onto the ground, landing right next to her catatonic mother, a tangled, weeping mess of ruined silk and shattered vanity. Preston did not even look back to see if she was hurt. He did not care about the woman he had married or the family he had destroyed. He looked around the grand ballroom, his eyes wide and frantic like a trapped rat searching for a way out. He saw the faces of the angry venture capitalists and the media recording his every desperate move. He knew that his grift was over. He knew that the money was gone, and the dangerous underground syndicates he owed would not be forgiving when they realized his wealthy cash cow was dead. Pure survival instinct took over his body. Preston turned away from the shattered remains of the Davenport family and bolted. He shoved his way past a bewildered cameraman, ignoring the angry shouts of the crowd as he sprinted down the center aisle of the ballroom. He was making a desperate, frantic run for the grand glass doors of the lobby, trying to put as much distance between himself and the screen, displaying his crimes as possible. I stood on the stage, holding Arya safely against my side, and watched him flee with a cold, unbothered calm. I did not ask my security team to stop him. I just watched him run, watching his expensive leather shoes slip slightly on the polished floor as he scrambled toward the exit like a coward. He thought he could escape into the dark Atlanta night. He thought he could slip away, hide in the shadows, and eventually find another wealthy, vulnerable family to drain. He truly believed he was smart enough to outrun the consequences of his actions. But my vengeance was a perfectly orchestrated symphony, and every single note had been written months in advance. I knew exactly where he would run, and I knew exactly who would be waiting for him when he got there. Preston reached the edge of the lobby, his breathing ragged and heavy, his hands extended to push open the heavy glass doors to freedom, his eyes fixed on the empty street outside. But just as his fingers brushed the cold glass, the piercing, deafening wail of multiple police sirens shattered the air outside the building. The sound was sudden and overwhelming, echoing violently off the surrounding skyscrapers and cutting through the chaotic noise of the ballroom. Tires screeched violently on the wet pavement outside the main entrance. Blinding flashes of red and blue lights illuminated the darkness, strobing intensely through the glass doors and casting long, terrifying shadows across Preston's pale, sweating face. He froze, completely paralyzed by the flashing lights of his own sudden demise, his hands still resting against the glass. The heavy doors were suddenly yanked open from the outside with incredible force. A fleet of police cars had formed a solid barricade across the street, blocking any possible route of escape. A team of stern-faced economic crime detectives wearing dark jackets and tactical vests stormed into the lobby. The lead detective held a federal arrest warrant firmly in his hand, stepping directly into Preston's path and entirely blocking his only way out of the nightmare I had created for him. The lead detective did not even blink as Preston tried to feint to the left, attempting a desperate escape toward the revolving doors. Two massive officers in heavy tactical gear lunged forward, slamming the fake aristocrat violently against the polished marble wall of the lobby. The sickening thud echoed all the way into the silent ballroom. Preston's expensive, custom-tailored suit jacket tore at the shoulder seam as the officers ruthlessly wrenched his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the heavy steel handcuffs, snapping shut, sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. For a brief second, Preston struggled against the grip of the detectives, his chest heaving as he stared out at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the glass doors. Then something inside him shifted. He did not hang his head in shame. He did not cry or beg for mercy the way a normal man would. Instead, the sophisticated, refined gentleman completely vanished into thin air. His fake, mid-Atlantic accent dropped instantly, replaced by a harsh, grating street sneer. He threw his head back against the marble wall and began to laugh. It was a loud, maniacal, unhinged sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. He looked past the officers right into the ballroom, locking eyes with the front row where Beatrice and Malcolm were trembling in shock. "You stupid, pathetic fools!" Preston screamed, his voice echoing fiercely through the massive space. "You practically handed me the vault codes on a silver platter. You were so obsessed with my skin color and my fake pedigree that you never even bothered to run a basic financial background check. You wanted a white aristocrat to elevate your precious bloodline so badly that you let me bleed your entire legacy completely dry. You bought the illusion without a single question because you are nothing but desperate, gullible garbage trying to play dress-up." Bianca was still crumpled on the floor, her silk gown ruined by the spilled wine and the dirt of the hardwood. When she heard the man she loved, the man she thought made her superior to me, call her gullible garbage, she let out a long, miserable wail. She pounded her fists against the floor, sobbing uncontrollably. Her entire reality, her social standing, her future had just been exposed as a cheap, dirty joke. She was no longer a high society princess preparing to rule the city. She was the punchline to the biggest con in Atlanta history, and she was married to the architect of her family's destruction. She tore at her own perfectly styled hair, screaming mindlessly into the void. The lead detective handed Preston off to his junior officers, instructing them to read him his rights and throw him into the back of the cruiser. The detective then turned and walked slowly down the center aisle, stepping deliberately into the grand ballroom. He did not look at the elite investors or the flashing media cameras that were documenting every second of the spectacular fallout. He walked straight toward the metal barricade where the shattered remains of the Davenport family were gathered. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a thick stack of folded warrants. "Beatrice Davenport," the detective said, his voice hard and uncompromising, cutting through the sounds of Bianca's wailing. "Malcolm Davenport." You are both required to accompany me to the federal building immediately for extensive questioning. We have frozen your accounts. The Davenport Family Legacy Fund is in a state of critical default. Millions of dollars of investor capital are unaccounted for. Furthermore, we have received preliminary evidence from anonymous sources regarding severe medical fraud and wire tampering. You are not victims here. You are prime suspects in a massive criminal conspiracy. Malcolm's eyes widened to the size of saucers. The paralyzing realization finally hit his brain with the force of a freight train. He was not just losing his company. He was not just a public laughingstock who had just been exposed as a sterile fraud. He was going to federal prison. The investors in the room, the very people he had invited to witness his glorious comeback, began to shout angrily, demanding their money, demanding answers from the man who had promised them endless returns. The walls were literally closing in around him. The flashing cameras felt like searchlights pinning him to the floor. The last microscopic shred of Malcolm's aristocratic pride completely evaporated. He dropped to his knees right there in front of the elite society he had worshipped his entire life. He ignored his screaming sister and his paralyzed mother. He literally crawled on his hands and knees across the space between the barricade and the stage. His expensive suit pants dragged across the dirty floor, picking up dust and spilled wine. He looked like a beaten, pathetic animal seeking shelter from a storm. He reached the edge of the elevated platform and gripped the dark wood with his shaking, sweaty hands. "Tessa," he sobbed, staring up at me with a face entirely drenched in tears and manufactured sweat. "Tessa, please, you have to save me. You have to use Aegis." His voice was a desperate, frantic whine. "You have billions in your control. You can bail out the fund. You can pay the investors and make the default go away. You can hire lawyers to make these detectives leave us alone. Please, Tessa. I am begging you on my hands and knees. We were family once. I know I made mistakes. I know my mother pushed you away, but I am begging for my life. Do not let them take me away in handcuffs. I will do anything you want. I will sign the company over to you. Just save me." I stood above him, looking down at the man who had once been the center of my universe. The man who had broken my heart and thrown me onto the street. I felt absolutely nothing. There was no pity in my chest, no lingering affection, no triumph even. Just a cold, clinical emptiness. I gently handed Arya over to my lead security director, who was standing in the shadows of the wings, making sure my beautiful daughter did not have to witness the pathetic display of her so-called father's family any longer. Once Arya was safely out of sight, I slowly walked to the very edge of the stage, stopping just inches from Malcolm's white-knuckled grip. I looked down into his desperate, sobbing eyes. I reached into the perfectly tailored pocket of my white blazer. My fingers brushed against a small, folded piece of paper. I pulled it out and held it up between my index and middle finger. It was the crisp $100 bill. The exact same bill Malcolm had arrogantly shoved into my hand just an hour ago when he thought I was a lowly event coordinator, when he told me to go buy myself a nice dress and disappear before his real guests arrived. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with a terrifying, absolute calm that easily cut through the noise of the angry investors, the flashing cameras, and the wailing of his sister. I held the bill out over his upturned face and simply let it go. The crisp green paper caught a slight draft from the massive air conditioning units above and fluttered slowly downward. It danced gently through the bright stage lights, twisting in the air before landing perfectly squarely across Malcolm's tear-stained cheek. "This is exactly what your legacy is worth to me, Malcolm," I said softly, leaning down just slightly, so only he and the detectives in the front row could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "Use that $100 to call a cheap cab and get the hell out of my building before I have my security team throw you into the street with the rest of the garbage." Malcolm let out a choked, agonizing gasp as the $100 bill slid off his face and fell to the floor. His hands released their grip on the stage and he collapsed backward into a pathetic, weeping heap. The mighty heir to the Davenport fortune. The man who had promised to rule the financial world was nothing but a broken, crying mess on the floor of my empire. He curled into a fetal position, waiting for the detectives to haul him away to a cold concrete cell. But even in the face of total absolute destruction, the parasite of aristocratic delusion refused to die quietly. Beatrice watched her son crawl and weep like a beaten dog. She watched her daughter thrashing on the floor in ruined silk. The sight of her completely decimated family seemed to awaken some dark, twisted reservoir of pride deep within her shattered psyche. She refused to be humiliated by a woman she still considered to be a peasant. She refused to bow to my authority or accept the reality of her own spectacular failure. Beatrice slowly pulled herself up from the floor. Her expensive designer gown was heavily stained with dark red wine, making it look as though she were bleeding out right there in the ballroom. Her silver hair was a tangled mess, and her perfect makeup was completely ruined, tracing dark streaks down her wrinkled cheeks. But she raised her chin with a fierce, terrifying delusion. She gripped the metal barricade with her trembling hands and glared up at me, her eyes burning with pure, unadulterated venom. She looked like a mad queen standing in the ashes of her own burning castle. "Do not look at us with your pathetic pity, Tessa," Beatrice hissed, her voice trembling with an insane, frantic energy that made the nearest investors take a step back. "You think you have won today. You think projecting some stolen bank records and calling the authorities makes you our equal. You think a few lost millions and a scandal will erase us from this city. The Davenport name is centuries old. We are institutions. You are just a temporary flash in the pan, a lucky little peasant who stumbled into money. My family is not dead." She pointed her shaking finger at the ceiling, gesturing to a sky she truly believed still belonged to her bloodline. "The ancestral estate still stands," Beatrice declared, her voice echoing over the murmurs of the stunned crowd. "The grand mansion, the heart of our family, is untouched by your little corporate games. I will sell every brick, every painting, every blade of grass if I have to. I will liquidate our history to rebuild this empire from the absolute ground up. We do not need a single drop of your filthy peasant money to survive. The Davenports will rise again, and when we do, we will erase you from this earth." The shrill, desperate voice of Beatrice Davenport echoed through the cavernous ballroom, bouncing off the crystal chandeliers and fading into a heavy, suffocating silence. She stood there, chest heaving, clutching the metal barricade with her wine-stained hands, her chin tilted upward in a grotesque parody of aristocratic pride. She genuinely believed her own delusions. She truly thought that the ancestral Davenport mansion, the massive sprawling estate that had hosted governors and titans of industry for generations, was an impenetrable fortress. She thought that as long as those stone columns and marble floors existed, she would always be a queen. I stood perfectly still on the elevated stage, holding my daughter close to my side, and I let Beatrice bask in her imaginary victory for a few fleeting seconds. I looked out at the sea of wealthy investors and powerful socialites, watching their faces shift from shock to profound pity. They recognized the frantic, manic desperation of a cornered animal. They knew just as well as I did that bloodlines and historical estates meant absolutely nothing when the bank accounts ran dry. But Beatrice was trapped in the past, entirely blind to the catastrophic reality of her present. A slow, quiet laugh escaped my lips. The sound carried through the microphone, washing over the silent crowd like a bucket of ice water. I did not look angry. I did not look offended by her threats. I looked at her with the cold, detached clinical interest of a scientist observing an insect under a microscope. "You are going to sell the estate, Beatrice?" I asked, my voice smooth and dangerously calm, completely devoid of any sympathy. "You are going to liquidate your history to rebuild your empire." I slowly shook my head, the faint, triumphant smile returning to my face. "You cannot sell something that no longer belongs to you, Beatrice." Her frantic breathing hitched. The defiant glare in her eyes wavered, replaced by a sudden flickering spark of absolute terror. She opened her mouth to argue, to scream another vicious insult at me, but the words died in her throat. I did not give her the chance to speak. I raised my hand and gave the final absolute signal to the technical production booth suspended high above the ballroom. The massive LED screen behind me flashed with a brilliant white light, forcing the people in the front row to squint against the sudden glare. The images of Preston's offshore accounts and offshore wire transfers melted away entirely. In their place, a new set of documents appeared on the screen. These were not medical records or simple bank statements. These were highly complex, legally binding property deeds and massive commercial loan agreements. The official seal of the state of Georgia and the Federal Banking Commission were stamped heavily across the top of each page. The crowd leaned forward, squinting at the dense legal text displayed on the 50-foot screen. But they did not need to understand every single legal clause, because the most devastating parts of the documents were highlighted in a brilliant neon yellow. The documents clearly proved that the Davenport ancestral estate, the supposed impenetrable fortress of their legacy, was entirely leveraged to the hilt. Beatrice had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to maintain the illusion of their infinite wealth. When Preston began draining the family funds to cover his gambling debts, she had to find a way to keep the lavish parties, the expensive cars, and the high society donations flowing. She could not bear the thought of her peers whispering about a dip in their finances. Her vanity was a bottomless pit that consumed everything it touched. So she had quietly, secretly signed away the very foundation of her family's history. She had taken out multiple massive high-interest mortgages on the estate, borrowing tens of millions of dollars against the property, just to keep up appearances and cover the catastrophic losses her son-in-law had accumulated. I looked down at Beatrice, who was now trembling so violently that the metal barricade rattled beneath her grip. "You mortgaged your own legacy." "Beatrice," I said, my voice ringing through the cavernous space. "You secretly sold the very walls that gave you your precious status, just to pay for Preston's fake ventures and your own ridiculous vanity. You drowned your family in toxic debt just so you could keep buying expensive dresses and hosting meaningless galas. The Davenport estate does not belong to you anymore. It belongs to the creditors you defrauded." Beatrice shook her head frantically, her wine-stained face turning a sickening shade of gray. "No," she gasped, her voice cracking. "No, that is a lie. The bank gave us an extension. We have time. The estate is protected. We have legal protections. You are trying to trick me. The bank promised we had another 90 days to restructure the debt." She was rambling, grasping at imaginary lifelines, completely unaware that I had already cut the rope. I took a slow, deliberate step toward the edge of the stage, looking down at her frantic, ruined face. "The bank did give you an extension, Beatrice," I replied softly. "The federal bank held your toxic debt for 6 months, waiting for you to pay. But when your fund went into critical default yesterday morning, they realized you were never going to produce the money. Banks do not care about your pedigree, Beatrice. They care about liquidity. So they cut their losses. They sold your massive toxic portfolio of debt at a steep discount to a private equity firm." Beatrice stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. She did not understand what I was saying. Her mind was too clouded by panic and aristocratic delusion to connect the final devastating dots. "The entity that purchased your debt." "Beatrice," I continued, my voice dropping to a low, terrifying register, "was a highly specialized private trust fund. A trust fund that is directly owned, operated, and managed by Aegis Investments." The collective realization hit the ballroom like a physical blow. The wealthy investors and journalists gasped, staring at me with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. I was the chief executive officer of Aegis. I was the sole controlling authority of the trust fund that had purchased the Davenport debt. "I am your legal creditor, Beatrice," I said, looking directly into her wide, panicked eyes. "I own your debt. I own the mortgages. I own the land. I own the bricks, the marble columns, the manicured lawns, and every single blade of grass on that property. I own the very air you breathe inside that house. The Davenport estate belongs entirely, unconditionally to me." Beatrice let out a low, agonizing moan, her knees buckling slightly. She tried to hold onto the barricade, but her strength was completely gone. "And because you are in critical default," I added, showing absolutely no mercy, "I signed the foreclosure order this morning. A federal judge has already approved the execution of the seizure. The authorities will be arriving at your ancestral estate at exactly 6 o'clock tomorrow morning. You and your family are being officially completely evicted. You have nothing left to sell, Beatrice. You have nowhere left to go. You are completely, utterly destitute." The sheer crushing magnitude of the punishment finally broke through the walls of Beatrice's delusion. The reality that she had lost absolutely everything hit her with the force of a falling anvil. She had lost her power, her status, her immense wealth, and the perfect aristocratic daughter-in-law she had so desperately craved. She had traded it all for a con artist who was currently sitting in the back of a police cruiser and a crushing mountain of toxic debt. And the ultimate absolute humiliation was that the woman she had abused, discarded, and called a barren peasant was now the undisputed legal owner of her entire existence. Beatrice's mind snapped completely. The metal barricade slipped from her grasp, and she collapsed backward onto the polished marble floor of the ballroom. She landed in the puddle of spilled wine, a broken, pathetic heap of ruined silk and shattered vanity. She clutched her chest, gasping for air, her eyes rolling back in her head as a primal, agonizing sob tore through her throat. She reached out her trembling, wine-stained hand, grasping blindly at the empty air, pleading silently for someone, anyone, to help her. She looked up at the front row of the audience, searching the faces of the Atlanta elite. These were the people she had hosted in her home, the people she had funded, the people she had gossiped and drank champagne with for decades. She expected them to rush forward to offer her comfort, to defend her against this brutal public execution. But the reality of high society is colder and more ruthless than any prison. The venture capitalists, the tech magnates, the old money matriarchs simply stared at her with expressions of absolute disgust. As Beatrice reached her trembling hand toward them, the elite members of Atlanta society did something completely devastating. They collectively synchronized, turned their backs on her. They stepped away from the barricade, putting physical distance between themselves and the shattered Davenport family, as if Beatrice carried a highly contagious fatal disease. No one reached out to help her up. No one offered a word of comfort. No one even looked at her. They completely erased her from their world in a matter of seconds. The Davenports were toxic, bankrupt frauds, and the social elite wanted absolutely nothing to do with them. Beatrice lay on the floor weeping miserably, realizing that her entire life had been a hollow, meaningless performance. Bianca was curled up a few feet away, crying hysterically into her hands, mourning the loss of her fake, glamorous life and her fraudulent husband. They were entirely, utterly alone, trapped in the trash can of high society, with no hope of ever climbing back out. The economic crime detectives, who had been standing by the barricade waiting patiently for the spectacle to conclude, finally stepped forward. The lead detective, a tall, imposing man with a stern expression, looked down at the broken, weeping family with professional indifference. He had seen wealthy criminals collapse before, and he had zero patience for their dramatic displays. He signaled to his junior officers. Two heavy-set policemen stepped forward and reached down, grabbing Beatrice firmly by the arms. They hauled the screaming, thrashing matriarch to her feet, ignoring her protests and her hysterical demands for her lawyers. They pulled her arms roughly behind her back, and the sharp metallic click of steel handcuffs echoed over her frantic sobbing. Another officer approached Malcolm. The former golden boy of the Davenport Empire was still kneeling on the floor, staring blankly at the crisp $100 bill resting near his knees. His spirit was completely broken, his mind entirely unable to process the total annihilation of his life. The officer grabbed him by the shoulder, hauling him upright with effortless force. Malcolm did not resist. His body was limp, his face pale and slack like a walking corpse. The officer snapped the heavy steel cuffs onto his wrists, pulling his arms tightly behind his back. "All right, let's go," the lead detective barked, gesturing toward the exit. You have a lot of questions to answer regarding federal wire fraud and illegal medical bribery. The officers began to march Beatrice and Malcolm down the center aisle of the ballroom. The crowd parted for them, a sea of silent, disgusted faces, watching the great Davenport family being paraded out in handcuffs. Camera flashes erupted in a blinding, continuous storm, capturing the ultimate walk of shame for the morning papers. Beatrice kept her head down, weeping miserably, unable to look at the people she had once ruled. But as they neared the heavy glass doors of the grand lobby, Malcolm stopped. He planted his feet firmly on the polished floor, resisting the pull of the officer for just a fraction of a second. He slowly, painfully turned his head and looked back over his shoulder toward the brightly lit stage. He looked directly at me. I was standing tall and powerful at the center of my empire, surrounded by absolute success and unshakable authority. The stage lights cast a brilliant golden glow over my white suit, making me look entirely untouchable. And held safely tightly in my arms was Arya. Our beautiful, brilliant daughter was resting her small head against my shoulder, her dark curls falling softly around her innocent face, perfectly safe and entirely loved. I met Malcolm's gaze from across the massive room. I did not smile. I did not gloat. I just looked at him with the cold finality of a woman who had completely excised a cancer from her life. Malcolm stared at us, and the absolute crushing weight of his regret finally hit him with a force that seemed to shatter his ribs. He saw the beautiful, perfect family he could have had. He saw the brilliant, unstoppable partner who would have elevated him to the very top of the world. He saw the daughter he had unknowingly thrown away because he was too weak to stand up to his mother's toxic delusions. He realized in that final, agonizing second that he had held a priceless, flawless diamond in the palm of his hand, and he had willingly, intentionally thrown it away just to keep a handful of worthless, dirty gravel. A single fresh tear spilled over his eyelashes, tracing a slow, painful path down his pale cheek. His chest hitched with a silent, devastated sob. "Keep moving," the officer ordered, giving Malcolm's shoulder a hard, uncompromising shove. Malcolm's head snapped forward. The heavy glass doors of the ballroom swung shut behind them with a loud echoing thud, sealing the Davenports out in the cold, dark night and leaving me standing in the warm, brilliant light of my absolute total victory. The heavy glass doors of the grand lobby swung shut with a final echoing thud, sealing the freezing night air outside and trapping the memory of the Davenport family's spectacular ruin in the past. I stood motionless on the stage, the bright lights washing over me as the faint wail of police sirens faded into the distance. The ballroom was utterly silent. The hundreds of wealthy venture capitalists, elite socialites, and ruthless media personnel were completely speechless. They had come to witness a corporate merger, and instead, they had watched the total annihilation of an Atlanta dynasty. I did not smile. I did not pump my fists in the air or shout a victory speech to the crowd. True absolute power does not need to announce itself. It simply exists. I turned my back on the empty glass doors and looked down at my beautiful daughter. Arya was resting her head against my chest, her small hands gripping the fabric of my white blazer. She was completely oblivious to the generational trauma that had just been severed and dismantled in front of her. She only knew that she was safe and held. I pressed a gentle kiss into her dark curls, breathing in the sweet scent of her shampoo. The toxic noise of Beatrice's screeching and Malcolm's pathetic weeping was gone. My mind felt incredibly clear, entirely unburdened by the ghosts of my past. From the dark shadows of the stage wings, a tall, familiar figure stepped out into the brilliant light. Xavier moved with a quiet, steady grace that was the exact opposite of Malcolm's frantic, cowardly energy. He did not rush or demand attention. He walked across the polished floor, his eyes fixed solely on me and Arya. He carried my long cashmere coat draped over his arm. The investors in the audience watched him, realizing that this was the true partner I had chosen, the man who stood beside me, rather than trying to crush me beneath his heel. Xavier reached my side and gave me a soft, knowing look. He did not ask if I was okay because he knew exactly how strong I was. He gently draped the heavy, warm cashmere coat over my shoulders, protecting me from the slight chill of the cavernous ballroom. His hand rested lightly on the small of my back, a grounding, comforting weight. We did not say a single word to the audience. We did not offer them any explanations or gloat over the destruction they had just witnessed. We simply turned our backs on the flashing cameras and the whispering crowd and walked off the stage together. Our complete silence, our utter disdain for the dramatic circus the Davenports had created, was the heaviest, most absolute sentence we could possibly hand down. We left them to rot in their own mess and stepped into our own future. The next morning dawned bitterly cold in Atlanta. A harsh, biting wind swept through the affluent northern suburbs, shaking the manicured oak trees and chilling the air. The sun was barely rising, casting a pale gray light over the sprawling ancestral Davenport estate. For generations, this massive stone mansion had stood as a monument to untouchable wealth and aristocratic superiority. It had hosted governors, senators, and the highest tier of Southern society. But on this freezing morning, it was nothing but a crime scene and a foreclosure site. At exactly 6 o'clock, a fleet of heavy moving trucks and federal bank vehicles breached the heavy iron gates of the property. Teams of repo men, federal agents, and private security contractors swarmed the immaculate lawns. The illusion was over. The heavy mahogany front doors were thrown wide open, and the brutal, humiliating process of liquidation began. I was not there to watch it, but my security team monitored the execution of the foreclosure, and the reports were absolute. The repo men did not care about the historical significance of the Davenport name. They hauled out antique French furniture, priceless oil paintings, imported crystal chandeliers, and massive silk rugs. They dumped the luxurious contents of the mansion unceremoniously onto the dead winter grass. The items that Beatrice had prized above human decency, the objects she had used to measure her worth against mine, were treated like ordinary cheap garbage. Beatrice and Bianca had been allowed to return to the estate just long enough to gather a few basic necessities before the locks were changed and the property was officially seized by Aegis. They stood together at the very edge of the long driveway, entirely banished from the home they thought they would rule forever. The cold wind whipped around them, biting at their exposed skin. They were no longer wearing their custom-tailored designer gowns or dripping in inherited diamonds. They were dressed in whatever mismatched sweatpants and heavy coats they could grab in the frantic 10 minutes the federal agents had given them. Beatrice Davenport, the terrifying matriarch who had dictated Atlanta high society for decades, looked incredibly small and pathetic. Her silver hair was a tangled mess, blowing wildly in the wind. She was shivering violently, her thin arms wrapped around her own chest. In her hands, she clutched 2 cheap plastic grocery bags containing a few pairs of underwear, some basic toiletries, and a handful of crumpled family photographs. That was all she had left in the world. Millions of dollars, generational status, an entire empire reduced to 2 plastic bags swinging in the freezing wind. Bianca stood beside her, weeping silently. Her face was swollen and red, her eyes raw from crying over her arrested, fraudulent husband and her completely destroyed future. She held her own plastic bag of belongings, staring blankly at the massive moving trucks driving over the perfectly manicured rose bushes. The elite neighbors, the wealthy families who lived in the surrounding mansions, drove past in their sleek black cars. They slowed down just enough to stare at the humiliating spectacle on the lawn, but not a single one of them stopped. No one rolled down their window to offer Beatrice a ride or a warm cup of coffee or a place to stay. The very society she had worshipped, the elite circle she had thrown me away to impress, had completely and totally turned its back on her. They looked at Beatrice and Bianca as if they were stray dogs. Their aristocratic pride, their toxic delusions of superiority, were entirely crushed beneath the heavy rubber wheels of reality. They were completely alone, shivering in the cold with absolutely nowhere to go, miles away from the cold, humiliating wreckage of the Davenport estate. I was sitting in a completely different world. My corner office at the top of the Aegis headquarters building was bathed in warm, brilliant morning sunlight. The floor-to-ceiling glass windows offered a breathtaking panoramic view of the entire Atlanta skyline. The space was sleek, modern, and completely silent, filled with the calm, productive energy of a truly successful empire. I was not thinking about Beatrice shivering on the curb, or Malcolm sitting in a federal holding cell. I had already completely deleted them from my mental space. They were a closed chapter, a lesson learned and discarded. I sat behind my massive polished glass desk, a hot cup of jasmine tea resting near my hand. The surface of my desk was clear except for a single thick stack of legal documents printed on heavy premium paper. Xavier was sitting in one of the plush leather chairs opposite my desk, reviewing a matching set of files with a quiet, focused intensity. He looked up and offered me a warm, encouraging smile. The documents in front of me were not foreclosure orders or vengeance tactics. They were the blueprint for something entirely new. I picked up my heavy silver fountain pen and smoothed my hand over the crisp front page. The document was a massive foundational directive to establish a specialized legal defense and financial recovery fund entirely backed by the resources of Aegis Investments. The fund was specifically designed to identify, protect, and empower women across Atlanta who were facing severe emotional, financial, and psychological abuse from powerful patriarchal families. I knew exactly what it felt like to be told I was worthless. I knew exactly what it felt like to be trapped by a family that used their wealth and status to crush my spirit and control my narrative. I had been that scared, isolated woman sitting in a doctor's office believing the devastating lies they had paid to construct. I was never going to let another woman go through that nightmare alone if I could help it. The fund would provide top-tier lawyers, emergency housing, aggressive financial auditing, and complete psychological support to women who needed to escape toxic, controlling environments. It would be a weapon against the very type of aristocratic abuse the Davenports had perfected. I pressed the nib of my pen to the signature line and signed my name with a smooth, sweeping motion. The ink dried instantly, sealing a multi-million-dollar commitment to tear down the shadows and build a fortress of genuine support. I closed the folder and slid it across the desk to Xavier. He took it gently, his eyes reflecting a deep, profound respect. We were not just building wealth. We were building a shield. I stood up from my desk, the soft fabric of my tailored trousers moving silently as I walked toward the massive glass walls of my office. The city of Atlanta stretched out below me, a sprawling network of steel glass and endless ambition. The morning sun was climbing higher in the sky, chasing away the cold gray shadows of the dawn and illuminating the streets with a fierce, brilliant golden light. The cars below looked like tiny crawling insects, and the people were just microscopic moving dots. I rested my hand lightly against the cool glass, taking a long, slow breath. The air in my lungs felt incredibly clean, entirely pure. I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the absolute serenity of the moment wash over my entire body. For so many years, I had allowed myself to be defined by the rigid, cruel expectations of a family that saw me only as a biological vessel and a social liability. I had allowed Beatrice's venom and Malcolm's cowardice to dictate my value. I had lived in the suffocating shadow of their humiliation, quietly accepting their narrative because I thought I had no other choice. But I had survived the fire they built to destroy me. I had not just crawled out of the ashes, I had gathered every single ember and used them to forge an impenetrable empire. I had stepped entirely out of the shadow of their abuse and ignited my own blinding light. I opened my eyes and looked out at the horizon. I was a mother to a beautiful, brilliant daughter. I was the architect of a financial titan that commanded the respect of the entire world. I had found a partner who saw my strength as a gift rather than a threat. I knew now with absolute, unshakable certainty that no family, no toxic matriarch, no cowardly husband, and no forged medical document could ever define who I was. Power is not given by marriage, and worth is not determined by bloodlines. True absolute worth is forged in the quiet, relentless determination to never let anyone else write your story. I smiled watching the sunlight hit the towering glass buildings of the city. The Davenports were dust blowing away in the cold wind, but I was standing at the very top of the world, and my empire was just beginning. The greatest lesson from this story is that your true worth is never defined by the people who refuse to see it. Sometimes the family you are born into will try to keep you small out of their own insecurities and greed. You do not have to accept the role of the victim or the outcast. True power comes from walking away from toxic environments and quietly building your own success on your own terms. The best revenge is simply living a brilliant, independent life. Have you ever had to cut ties to protect your peace? Tell us your story.